Hi, everybody. Hello.
What?
Sorry about this. I think Tony's going to have to dial back in, so my apologies. Um, Eugene, let me be the one that introduces you. Of course, it was supposed to be Tony, and then we'll wait for Tony to come back in a second to start the questions. But ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Eugene Soltes. Eugene is from Harvard University. He has a lifelong experience in investigating fraudulent behavior and has written a book, as Patrick mentioned. And I think that you're going to find, like, say, his in-depth analysis of analyzing and understanding behavior quite interesting, quite fascinating, and a great way to start this conference. Uh, Eugene, why don't you start with just a quick hello and introduction, and then we can start. Then we can move to the questions.
Great. I'd be happy to, and happy to get the ball rolling. And thank you so much for the kind invitation to join today, because it's such an important topic, and especially when we think of factoring in some of the recent events and fraud. I think it's naturally something that's actually acquired even greater attention. So my background, I've been at Harvard Business School for the last 11 years. All my work is focused on organizational misconduct, and much of this was initially motivated by the why question. Why do we see people? And it's not the street criminals that make into boardrooms, but oftentimes really quite extraordinary executives and managers at leading organizations. Why do we see them fall prey to some of these limitations and challenges? And so it was originally motivated by the psychology, which I think what Tony will be discussing a little bit. And then more recently, over the last 4 or 5 years, what we've really been focusing on is how do we use data to try to detect that? So I'll look forward to sharing. Tony, welcome back.
We don't only have fraud problems in this world, we have technical issues as well. Apologies for the snafu there. Just want to get this meeting back on my screen. For some reason it's disappeared. There you are. Great. We just deal with this as well. And we'll be in business. Okay, great. Welcome back, and I suppose welcome back to me as well. So you obviously know that I'm here with Professor Soltes, and you've heard from him. He's immensely qualified, as you heard from Patrick, to talk about the psychology of a fraudster and why it matters. And having studied the subject of fraud for as long as you have, and interviewed a rogues gallery, including Bernie Madoff, who ran a $65 billion Ponzi scheme, the biggest in history, Tom Petters, the perpetrator of a $2 billion fraud, Andy Fasto, folks from WorldCom, McKinsey, and others. You've clearly forgotten more than most people will ever know about what motivates such behavior. So in the next 20 or so minutes, with time for Q&A in the chat, let's delve straight into it, if it's okay with you.
Perfect.
So, as we are in the factoring business, you'll probably understand that we are extending credit on open account terms. We facilitate people's shipping goods, invoicing them, and then waiting and trusting to get paid when it's the due date. One of the big criteria of the 5 C's of extending credit is character, probably the most important in assessing such a risk. And in the context of fraud, how important is character based on your past analysis relating to fraudulent behavior? Are bad people always the ones that you can expect to commit a fraud, or is it good ones as well?
I like how you framed it, good people versus bad people. And I only wish the world maybe was that simple. And in fact, if one goes back 100 years ago, many of the most prominent criminologists, both in Europe and the United States, were actually trying to come up with ways of characterizing fraudsters based upon physical depictions, certain types of psychological analysis. And I think what we've come to realize over the last, since then, over the last 100 years, is that in many ways, we're all susceptible. Under the right circumstances, with the right pressure, the right opportunity, many people are probably familiar with things like the fraud triangle. We all can fall prey to these kind of what I call terrible motivations and the slippery slope. And so there's a time factor associated with it. How often, I often like to characterize it, is that we all think we know the difference between right and wrong, and that's what keeps us from becoming the quote bad person. But I think we can all look at our daily lives and find things that we know are wrong, but we still do it, even our violations. Speeding and driving is the easiest example. We all, I'm sure, if we could raise our hands here, we all speed, and we say it's a minor violation going 10 kilometers or 10 miles per hour over the speed limit. What we need is we need to feel that something is harmful. This is why I don't think anyone on today's webinar would go out and hit or stab their neighbor, no matter how aggravated they were. Why? Reasonably socialized people simply don't do that because it feels harmful. But in the really abstract nature in which a lot of fraud occurs, misconduct in the boardroom, it doesn't have that same feeling of harmfulness, that same kind of deep-seated human nature gut instinct. And as a result, it allows us to actually proceed with these oftentimes really extraordinarily detrimental tasks when it comes to financial transactions without feeling that it's necessarily so harmful. So character is incredibly important. It's being able to identify that character and then appreciate when that character is evolving and changing over time.
Very interesting. So in your opinion, what are the signs of fraud that we should be on guard for and prepare ourselves for this worst case scenario? Are there any cases where the issue of character has been jeopardized and the fraudster successfully pulled the wool over our eyes?
In many cases, I think it's very easy to lull ourselves into it, particularly when I'll say the returns that I'll say a outside party is generating is attractive. Our kind of antennas can often go down. I often, one of the more prominent examples that everyone knows about, Madoff, obviously. One of the things that's I think really interesting to think about his case that some investors believed, and certainly he viewed as kind of the secret sauce himself, is that since he ran a broker-dealer, he figured that most people thought he probably was just front-running trades. So the investment advisory business was able to generate these extraordinary returns because he would front-run through his investment, his broker-dealer, thereby generating it. And investors were tacitly okay. That's absolutely a violation. He would be shut down. He might actually go to prison for that. But in the end, the investors would simply get their money returned, and they would have generated these fantastic returns year over year. It turns out he wasn't front running. He was literally engaged in a pyramid scheme, and the funds were not there. Obviously, investors would not have wanted that. But there's something quite perverse and fascinating that both he and it appears some of investors were comfortable with. If this is front running, let's keep this going while we can. And when it stops, like we've all at least made out a little bit better.
It's interesting because I heard Andy Fastow the other day, and he says that actually he's quite confident that he was actually following the letter of the law. He had legal opinions saying everything he was doing was kosher. And yet when it came to the law and courts, he was the wrong side of it.
There are, I'll say, a number of fascinating cases in which I'll say that the technical law and the spirit of law, those are oftentimes separated. I mean, one of the examples I oftentimes do a lot around corruption. There's a lot of ways to pay bribes that are not, well, say that undermine the spirit, but may not be technically incorrect. I'll give a favorite example that I learned is somewhat popular right before COVID when I was traveling. I kind of collect these types of transactions, but to the extent you're in certain parts, particularly in Southeast Asia, where bribes are still necessary and quite common to do certain types of business transactions, companies are naturally concerned about FCPA, UK Bribery Act, and other laws that are very strict against such payments. What have some I don't want to say by means all or even most, but what is some firms sought to do? What they've used the art market, and so what they will do is actually give for example, a painting that's worth $500 to a minister, and then note to the minister that if he or she was to sell this painting at an auction at this obscure auction house in the northeast part of the country in 6 months, it might be worth a lot more. And so what does the company do? They go back a couple months later, they purchase the painting for $50,000. That's again on their books and records, fully appropriate. It's an auction. It's an arm's length transaction. But what have you done? You've effectively transferred $49,500 in funding to that minister. Absolutely corrupt. Absolutely, that is bribery. But you've done it in the kind of circuitous, I'll say clever way. And as long as you haven't put this on an email, you're almost certainly going to get away with this.
Yeah, interesting. You've written that fraud is a counter-cyclical trend, that it happens during times of crisis. The factoring community has been relatively unscathed from fraud to date in this particular period in the pandemic. Do you see this crisis period as different from others? And do you predict that fraudulent behavior will increase during this boom and bust period that we're living in?
It's a great point, because this is such for so many reasons, it's such an extraordinary period. But I would give one word to say, especially when it comes to factoring, that makes this unusual. It is capital. Access to capital is still so plentiful. And to the extent, boom, bust, whatever period, if we have access to enough capital, it allows fraudulent activity, fraudsters, to persist for an awfully long time, because they find other ways of accessing capital, more clever ways of injecting that within the organizations to ultimately sustain it. So I suspect what we will see is, when this access to capital reduces, and there's a lot of reasons why that may change over time, we will see the shore kind of recede, and I think we'll see a significant amount of fraudulent, or at the very least very aggressive and unwise financial activity be exposed.
Well, when people commit fraud, some don't even realize that they're doing it, or think it's just part of, doing business as normal. I mean, in my opinion, it sounds more like monkey business. But what are your findings in this regard?
There's a lot of transactions, I'll say, that operate on that borderline. And going back to our discussion a few months ago, talking about Andy Bastow and the bribery. I think it's the ability to rationalize a lot of transactions that violate the spirit, but might be technically above board. I'll give another example. Around trading. Most every country around the world, in fact, every country jurisdiction now has a law against insider trading. When you have access to material information, trading on that information and misappropriating it. But I'll say a common phenomenon that I've been spending a lot of time looking into is what I call trading in stock substitutes. So to the extent you have material information in firm A, what about trading in firm B that's highly correlated with it? That's outside. Or let's even be a little bit more, let's trade in an ETF that is highly overweighted in firm B. So effectively how that ETF will move when you have that material information A. In that instance, at least conceptually, that would still be misappropriating information. The notion of insider trading, I would argue, in no jurisdiction around the world would there be either the ability or frankly the will to investigate or prosecute people for trading in ETFs of highly correlated securities of information. And then, since that strikes me as kind of the monkey business, you effectively can learn how to engage in insider trading without technically insider trading as historically defined. And that's what I think of clever fraud looks like. You start with that and you realize, this is great. I can get away with doing this, and it expands and expands and expands. And given the financial incentives associated with being more aggressive in most all markets around the world, there's a lot of very smart people coming with very smart ways to engage in transactions like this.
That's fascinating. I just want to mention to everybody who's listening that by all means, take the opportunity to ask the professor any questions that you might have. It seems like this is a golden opportunity to ask one of the best in the business. So please use the chat for that, and we'll scan it to see what questions, smarter questions you've got than the ones I've prepared for the professor. But going on with my list for the time being, you talk about reverse psychology in your book. And there have been fraudulent scenarios where fraudsters create an allure that one must do business with them, basically sucking in the person without ensuring the safeguards and doing proper due diligence. Can you describe such a scenario and what was the result? I mean, I suspect that Madoff was one of these folks where people were lining up to get into this fund, and that he used this, sorry, you can't join this club, it's very exclusive, which made them even more desirous of being in it.
That's a fantastic example. I mean, I'll say the best frauds are one in which the fraudster has in some way rationalized or convinced himself or herself that they are not actually a fraudster. And oftentimes, obviously, that's totally absurd. They're engaging in quite blatant fraud, but they've figured out some way of rationalizing that that's the norm, or that's in Madoff's situation, simply a temporary situation. So he is not a fraudster. And I would say I've spent time with nearly every prominent major executive who engaged in fraud over the last decade, and no one describes himself, even Madoff, when he was alive, would not describe him as a fraudster. He's described himself as someone who, made a series of mistakes over a number of years. But people see themselves as are able to isolate, I made a mistake, I made the books and records violation, but I'm not a fraudster. And so they're able to bring people in with a sense of genuineness that they are a well-respected, high-integrity businessman. And that makes a very effective pitch because they don't need to trick you, because they don't need to trick themselves. It was fascinating that no one sees himself also as really the bad guy. I mean, the people who I spoke with who engage in insider trading would say, that's really a technical violation. There's not even really an identifiable victim. It's the people engaged in fraud that are bad. And the people engaged in fraud would say, you know what, I was really trying to build a company. And this would be the same with factoring. I was trying to facilitate transactions in the market, and things went out of control. I was too ambitious, I appreciate, but at least I was trying to build something. It's the people engaged in Ponzi schemes that are the real problem, because they weren't even trying to build things. And then you talk to the people engaged in these massive pyramid schemes, and they would say, yeah, ultimately things got out of control, and maybe a couple $100 million, maybe $1 billion or $2 billion were lost. But compare that to the last financial crisis, where we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars were lost, and then none of those executives even went to prison. And so there's this weird way of rationalizing that no matter what you do, even when you engage in a $1 billion pyramid scheme, you find you're just in kind of this larger spectrum in the financial markets, and there's really many more people who are in the public that are much worse. And it's that ability to rationalize to yourself that makes you very effective as a
it's interesting though, but it's one of the biggest things that we worry about in our business is collusion, where the seller and the buyer collude to create a false fake purchase order and a fake invoice, and you call to verify the invoice, and somebody who's been paid off verifies it. It seems to me that there was a premeditated effort to defraud a financier. It wasn't like, oh, I got suckered into this, I'm setting out to do bad things, and there we go. How do we be on guard against that? How can one protect against that?
This is it's a great point, but it is still, I think, a spectrum there. And I'll say, I look at a lot of student presentations that are going to try to raise VC funding, and I've looked at a lot of when they say we have committed clients, we have a committed firm that's going to buy our product. I've learned the word committed. Even what they define as revenue, let's just say it would not be past a GAAP or IFRS type analysis. Sometimes that's they literally responded to an email. Sometimes it's a phone call. Sometimes they might have actually something on paper, but they'll use the same very ambitious language and use this word committed, which has a sense that you're going to get this money, which I would say 9 out of 10 times you probably will not. But this is where that great due diligence comes into play. When you start getting kind of the whiffs and signs, you start poking around, you start to see where people are on that spectrum of, how much is it puffery, especially businesses that are growing rapidly and you see executive being pressed. I think there's always some amount of puffery, what I will say, in almost all markets. And as people are proud of what they're achieving, is that puffery going to come back to harm you and get you? Or is that simply someone being proud and trying to show their vision? And I think That's what we need to try to separate, but it's very, very challenging.
It certainly is. We've had an interesting question from the audience. How do we reinforce to executives facing financial pressure that committing fraud does harm, it causes harm, and that they are crossing a line?
So the harm, I actually will say the first, I'll say humbly, I don't know the first, in that I spend a lot of time with students, and we obviously are discussing in our exec ed programs about the consequences of harm. And I think if you really get down and start speaking about who is harmed, it's quite abstract. I mean, you have to go through this line of some investments harmed, and who are the investors in that are pension funds or endowments, there are other people who are invested. And those are people that it's your parents, it's your family, it's your friends. It's a very circuitous chain. And so, I mean, there's been experiments of people trying to put like literally photos of investors around so people can see that these are actually the people you're acting on behalf. So when you engage in fraud and deception, you are harming them. I'll say all these kind of nudges work temporarily for a little bit of time, but are very hard to sustain. And I think that's really the challenge. I view it as trying to keep humility among those that we want to work with. If I could think of one character trait that you often find in people who, let's say, not necessarily are fraudsters, but get into trouble or are more inclined, it's a lack of humility. That when anything is thrown their way, they can simply overcome it by pushing a little bit harder. I think we all need to have some humility that we all have failings, we all have limitations, but we try to place the appropriate controls and roadblocks and due diligence to allow us to see around those blind spots. And so the best organizations are ones in which they put those controls not just on others, but also on themselves. So we're not biased and taken over, for example, by great returns. And so we stop, scrutinizing maybe certain other counterparties as much.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to recognize the wolf in the sheep's clothing. So let's move on to digitization. Our world of international trade and factoring has historically been one that's been very paper-based. It's a bit like, wearing visors and, quill pens. And slowly and quite importantly, these trends are changing. We're becoming digitized. There's even government use of e-invoices. Processes are being digitized, including the blockchain. So my question is, do you think that the move from paper to digits will really improve the safety in doing business and prevent fraud?
I think this is one of the more exciting, because we can spend all day trying to look at character, but sometimes it's really getting to the data that even the most brilliant people, you can't trick the data. And so a lot of the work that we're focused on, and I run an outside organization, Integrity Lab, that was really a spin out from some of the research to really start using this big data to try to identify fraud. Blockchain, artificial intelligence, they've become almost so ubiquitous that they become quite meaningless. But I'll say, if we think about what is this trying to achieve with big data, with analytics, I'll give an example that where we spend some of our time is, we'll take 1 billion transactions and we're trying to look at which might be fraudulent and corrupt. And how do we do that? You'll take the 100 or 200 fields of data. Where the payee is, what currency, the address, how long they've interacted. And you basically think of putting 100 flags in. And the great part is, and you say, well, this person has only worked with us for 3 days. The bank account and the location of the person are in different locations. The currency is different than the bank, the primary currency of the bank. All these warning signs. And you can quickly go through in real time, tens, hundreds of millions of transactions, and start scoring those for which of these actually pose a greater risk. And then you actually look into those. And almost any organization, even with extraordinary controls, will start to find some that look a little bit suspicious. But the brilliant part is that it's basically taking our mindset, the thing that we would normally be doing on paper, scrutinizing, this transaction looks a little bit odd. And now we're taking that mindset and we can just put it in an algorithm. and just process transactions at a much higher rate and speed than we ever could with bodies. And I think that's one of the most exciting innovations, particularly is there's greater access to structured data. It's digitized.
But isn't this somewhat of an arms race in a way? Because the nasties, the fraudsters, have equal access to digitization. And we've seen with cybercrime and everything else that they're not schlumps when it comes to using digits to get their way.
That's a great point. The challenge that the fraudster has in this is that they need to figure out what the entire universe. So if you're a firm that, let's say, works with 100 different counterparties, your fraudster needs to figure out, well, what do the other 100 counterparties look like on average, and what would not look anomalous? And I'll say certainly there are very clever people that are able to achieve that. Certainly, I'll say in the short run, we're working on some work with the Treasury of thinking about designing an algorithm for tax evasion. And I will say it becomes very hard when I think of the, for example, tax context. If you're going to engage in tax evasion, you can think about clever ways to be a little bit more aggressive that would still be in sync. But as you get farther and farther away, this is where data exposes it. You can't actually become that, I'll say, profitable as a fraudster if you don't actually deviate. So that's the conflict. You stay within the norms, you're actually not doing fraud, at least as effectively or as ambitiously. As you deviate more, you're more likely to be caught. And I think that's the game. And I suspect what we see with fraudsters is they start normal, they try to get a little bit more aggressive. And it's when they get, frankly, greedy. They probably could have tried to take a little bit more, but it's when they start to get I'll say a little bit more aggressive that we can catch people with data. And that's what's so exciting. And I think the factoring business is obviously one that's quite primed with, as things become digitized, given the amount of information accessible, to really look at that in detail.
Thank you very, very much for that. Very insightful. So we have about 10 minutes left, and we're getting some interesting questions. So I'd like to ask you this one. In your opinion, is it possible to have a risk-based approach to managing fraud risk with factoring clients? Can we rely on any model to differentiate our clients, or should we apply a consistent approach across the board?
So there's a lot. I think there's two ways of thinking about this. So first, absolutely, I think there are ways we can to do a data-driven risk-based approach by taking different pieces of information and structuring that to see how consistent one is over time. I think the challenge is figuring out how far one wants to probe and how far one wants to think, because this gets into, I will say, privacy. This gets into also how, I'll say, the yuck factor. I'll say we're doing one project right now, and in a slightly different context, but just when people call anonymous whistleblowing hotlines, more often than not, people are calling with oftentimes complaints and not actual allegations of fraud. What we're trying to do is help organizations try to prioritize which calls might actually be true cases of fraud, so they really get on top of those faster. What's one of the strongest predictors about whether a call would be substantiated? It's whether the person has called in the past and actually said something that was substantiated. If they've called 8 times before and it's always not been true, the 9th time's also probably not true. So on one hand, an algorithm or a risk-based approach would say, well, if you've called 8 times before, the 9th time's probably also not substantiated. So a risk-based approach said, let's just ignore that or put that on the back burner. I think what we would say, though, is an outside party looking in this, if the 9th time the person calls, and that's the doozy, that's the big one, and you say, well, why did you not look at that for 6 months? And you're like, well, our risk-based approach and it said, and all the evidence suggests that wasn't likely to be significant, and that's why it would seem pretty reckless. And let's just say there would lots of nasty articles written about that. And I think that's a challenge of where can we actually use a risk-based approach, and where does that run into, I would say, our common sense, reputational, and also kind of moral obligations that we have. But I will say this is where we spend a lot of time, because I think being more creative, let me put, about how we would approach risk is, I'll say, the fun and interesting part, rather than saying, in financial markets using the very traditional financial models. Can we bring in other factors that are really important in assessing risk, but maybe we're overlooking, let me put it like that.
Got it. Now, a question from Stephanie. She's asking if you've experienced internal staff committing fraud. That's to say, in our case, it's the seller rather than the buyer who is committing fraud. Have you experienced that situation?
Yes, and unfortunately, lots of that, and that's oftentimes the most devious in the way that your controls, which are oftentimes meant to try to mitigate or prevent fraud from external parties, are then compromised. And I'll say this can happen quite naturally in that, for example, you have one person that works within your organization and they brought in a counterparty that they were really excited by, was doing wonderful, but that counterparty is performing less well, and you don't want to admit that failure to others. All of a sudden, you start hiding things. You start effectively covering up their fraud on their part. One of the things that we've done with organizations to try to think about this is there's a measure called psychological safety. One of the most well understood and I would say researched areas. If you want to understand which hospital is likely to actually commit mistakes, you don't actually look at the reputation of the hospital, the name brand of the hospital, or even the history of the surgeon. You look at what is the psychological safety of nurses and medical professionals at that hospital. Do they feel comfortable speaking up when there's a mistake? If the surgeon picks up the wrong scalpel, can the nurse speak and tell the surgeon that? The same thing goes actually for private organizations. If you're in organizations in which when mistakes occur, people do not feel comfortable raising those errors because they know there'll be so much blowback, is where you see internal fraud occur. So one of the things we do with organizations is say, let's do it's the internal surveying, cultural assessment of understanding psychological safety between different parts of the organization and also measured across time to understand, are there new managers coming in? Is pressure changing in such a way that psychological safety is going down and leads to this kind of, I'll say, internal fraud / cover up. Good people that get in tough positions that don't have psychological safety oftentimes do, unfortunately, pretty terrible things.
Absolutely. Well, maybe we have time for one last question. And maybe this is perhaps a wrap-up question, which perhaps you could use in that context. So you've interviewed numerous infamous fraudsters in your career. What are the 2 or 3 common denominators that you take away from these interviews?
So I will say the exercise I've always wanted to do is to take some of the people that were in my book, former CEOs of some of the most prominent companies, and bring them into my class where normally we'll have a Fortune 100 CEO, at least 1, maybe 2 over the course of the semester, and have them all 3 give a talk about integrity for 5 minutes, corporate integrity, and ask students and participants, who's the person that literally just got out of prison for 3 years and who's the current, Fortune 100 CEO? I'm very confident, it's not even a hypothesis, at this point I'm willing to assert, that people would not call it correctly. You would not be able to figure out the CEO that just got out of prison from the current CEO, in part because many of the most effective people who engage in this action are able to project with such confidence their vision, their integrity, and the passion that they have. And so I'll say that's a consistent factor I see around very successful people that unfortunately is not differentiable between those who engage in fraud and those who have not. I alluded to humility before because at least as I look at that as the characteristic, at least I'm now most attuned to, is you can have people that are very successful, very confident, and are achieving a lot, but they're also willing to admit mistakes, sometimes only even it's just the minor ones, but they're able to describe those with some degree of humility, or at least in some a joking way of silly things they've done in the past and they've learned from and changed. I've been surprised that there are a subset of people that seem to be unable or unwilling to ever admit error, even when the error is overwhelming, literally sitting in front of them. I think that's what worries me most, because if someone cannot admit an error ever to someone else, I don't think they're admitting it to themselves ever. And this gets into the idea that they can literally engage in fraud and not even see or realize it's fraud. So I would end on the notion of humility as being the single most important characteristic in to identify and look for in others that one works with.
Well, humility is a wonderful attribute. You have exhibited it, despite the fact that you have immense expertise. It's been a pleasure to talk with you, and I'm sure our audience very much appreciates all of your insights. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Soltes. We look forward to watching you and reading about you in the time to come. And thank you all participants for participating in this. I'm now going to hand over to Peter Mulroy to continue the program.